Hey, it's Janelle Waz, and welcome back to another episode of Waz Reviews. Since I did a video about the Sega CD version of the first Ecco the Dolphin game, it's only right that I cover the Sega CD version of its sequel, Ecco the Dolphin: The Tides of Time. Of the two games, I consider Tides of Time to be the better game. Sure, it has some plot holes, but the overall gameplay mechanics, the game's difficulty, and even the way the game looks and sounds were vastly improved. And that's just talking about the Genesis version of the game. The Sega CD port is supposed to be an enhanced version. Now, I spoke highly of the Sega CD version of the first Ecco game, even going as far to say it's even better than the original. But what about Tides of Time? Is Tides of Time's Sega CD port like the port of the first game in the series? Is the Sega CD version even better than the original Genesis version? And which one should you play? Well, boot up the Sega CD again and get your water wings ready. We've got a future to save.
This is no time to argue about time.
But before I go further, make sure you subscribe to my channel. I talk a lot about Star Trek, video games, and whatever else I feel like talking about. And if you'd like to help support the channel, consider becoming a member. Be great to have you aboard. So this review is going to be roughly the same format as my review of the Sega CD version of the first Ecco game. Since I already did a review of the Genesis game, I won't be talking about the core game in this review. It's still the same game with no changes to plot or how to play the game. Once again, for a review of the core game, I'll point you to my review of the Genesis version of the game. In this review, I'll be focusing on the improvements in the Sega CD version of the game. It's also worth mentioning that Tides of Time was my first video game, specifically the Genesis version of the game. I won't deny my bias in favor of the Genesis version, but I'll try my best to give as honest and as fair a review as I can for the Sega CD port. But a recap for those who are new here, Ecco the Dolphin: The Tides of Time takes place right after the events of the first game. Ecco has just saved his pod from the vortex, i.e. aliens who were siphoning Earth's resources for food, and has led his pod back to the oceans of Earth via a giant alien tube. Ecco, however, left a bit of a mess back on planet Vortex, and the Vortex Queen is stunned that a mere dolphin defeated her. Though she clearly tries to cope with the fact that she was feeding at the time, so she wasn't exactly in her best state at the moment. So now she's left with one choice: follow Ecco back to Earth and start a new hive. It's up to Ecco to prevent the future where the Vortex have turned Earth into a cloudy hellscape and restore the natural flow of time. The Vortex Queen, she's back, and this time, she's mad. So, like with any Sega CD game, especially a Genesis port, let's talk about the updated CD quality audio. After all, I raved about the updated soundtrack of the first game. How does the Sega CD Tides of Time soundtrack fare? It's okay. It sounds nice and fits with the ocean adventure genre that Ecco is. While it still uses synthesizers like the first game's improved soundtrack, I noticed more percussion was used in the Tides of Time soundtrack. It even sounds a bit more upbeat than the first game, which is fitting. The first game had a much more eerie, mysterious feeling than Tides of Time, which feels more like an adventure game despite the fact that Earth is facing a new invasion. It still has its eerie moments, but less so. I don't know, maybe that's just me. But even though it's an okay soundtrack, it's mostly uninteresting. Most of the songs sound roughly the same. The original Genesis soundtrack was filled with distinct and memorable songs, each conveying different moods. Some were quieter and calmer, others were mournful, and others gave you that eerie feeling while swimming in darker, unknown parts of the sea. I just don't get that with the Sega CD soundtrack. All the songs kind of blend together with an occasional song that sounds different. The first game's Sega CD soundtrack was completely different from the original, but in my opinion, it was much better than the original soundtrack. For Tides of Time, I wish the Sega CD soundtrack was an enhanced version of the Genesis soundtrack. Again, I have a bit of a bias for the Genesis soundtrack because it's one of my favorite video game soundtracks, but the Sega CD's Tides of Time soundtrack just left me feeling a bit disappointed. Something else that I expected was updated sound effects. It wasn't much in the first game, but the crashing of the waves sounded much more realistic in the Sega CD version. As far as I can tell with the audio in the Tides of Time port, everything sounds the same with the exception of some of the glyph sounds. And even those sound effects I only triggered a couple of times, otherwise even they sounded the same. Okay, so the soundtrack, while an alright soundtrack, was mostly a miss for me, and the audio wasn't updated. But surely there's FMV to be had in this port. After all, this is a Sega CD game. Yep, there is most definitely FMV. In fact, the FMV here is much more exciting than the random dolphin documentary in the first game's port.
They communicate non-stop with squawks, blats, barks, grunts, pops, clicks, claps, and whistles.
Scattered throughout the levels are history glyphs, which show you 3D rendered movies of the key moments from the first game, which is a real treat. Ecco losing his family and beginning his journey, meeting the Big Blue, the asteroid, using the time machine and making his way through the Jurassic period, and getting powers to fry sharks and aliens with his mind. He even takes on the Vortex Queen with his powers. Sure, the effects are very much 90s 3D rendered graphics, but this is the closest you'll get to seeing an Ecco the Dolphin movie. And for 90s 3D graphics, it doesn't look bad. Sure, it can be a little stiff in some areas, but it's also fluid and smooth in others. Heck, there are even some interesting camera angles. It's almost like watching a movie. I'm not sure why these videos were created, and quick Googling didn't turn up much. Were they movies for a scrapped Ecco game? Were they just created for the Sega CD? Were they part of a pitch for another Ecco game? Whatever the reason for these FMV movies, I'm glad they're here and that I got to see them. However, like with the first game's port, the FMV movies highlight one of the problem areas of porting a Genesis game to the Sega CD: the load times. Like with the first game's port, the Sega CD has to spin in order to load game assets, something that wasn't present in the Genesis games. But it's so much more noticeable in the Sega CD version of Tides of Time. FMV has to load, levels have to load, heck, even some dialogue has to load. A couple of times, I even thought the game froze on me. And then the level would load up and I would breathe a sigh of relief. It comes with the territory of playing any game on a CD, which is why I appreciate load screens now. But if you're used to playing this game on the Genesis, you're definitely going to notice the load times. Now, I know it sounds like I've been coming down hard on this port, but what about the overall gameplay? Has that been improved at least? Well, not that I can tell. Look, I've been playing Tides of Time almost my entire life. Like I said, it was my first video game. I practically know this game like the back of my hand.
Jeez, I never noticed that before.
For the life of me, though, I cannot tell any difference between playing the game on the Genesis or playing on the Sega CD. Okay, the password of the last level I played was already filled in when I booted up the game on the Sega CD, and I didn't need to re-enter it. But that's about it. One of the things I praised the Sega CD port of the first game was the inclusion of checkpoints. Basically, if you die during a level, you can restart the level from the last glyph you sonar'd. It made the game a bit easier and a much more pleasant experience. This game, no checkpoints. Now, in defense of Tides of Time, it's a much easier game than the original. The levels are shorter and easier, so you really don't need additional checkpoints, at least not like the original. For the tougher parts, there are still save glyphs around, but they're also in the original Genesis game at those spots. Heck, the Sega CD version doesn't even come with new additional levels or puzzles to solve. It has hard mode, which has additional levels, but they're also a part of the Genesis game as well. What exactly am I getting with this port? And that's exactly the point. Other than the FMV movies, there's nothing the Sega CD port of Tides of Time has over the Genesis game. It's simply the same game with a less interesting or memorable soundtrack. Sure, it has those sweet FMV movies, but honestly, in this day and age of the internet, you can find them online. Ultimately, you're not getting anything really exclusive with the Sega CD version of the game. Now, you're more than likely to happen upon the Genesis cartridge of Tides of Time than the Sega CD disc, but if you happen upon both and have to choose one, go for the Genesis version. You're getting the same game for less money and with a better soundtrack. That being said, as a lifelong fan of the series, I'm happy that I own the Sega CD version, as well as the Game Gear version. If you're a collector, it might be worth picking up a Sega CD copy to complete the collection, but if you're just looking to play the best version of the game, go with the Genesis. Besides, it's not like the Sega CD game doesn't end on a cliffhanger. I'm still waiting, Sega! So, what do you think? Have you played the Sega CD version of Ecco the Dolphin, The Tides of Time? Did you love it? Did you hate it? What's your preferred method of playing Tides of Time? Genesis or Sega CD? And what are some of your favorite Sega CD games? Please, leave comments below and discuss. As always, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Waz Reviews. If you like what you see, why not give my video a like and subscribe to my channel? Tell your friends! Until next time...
I've been waiting for this my whole life.